History conceals its darkest secrets on forgotten pages. Wars, plagues, mysteries, and ruin. This is Sinister Empires if you are prepared to confront the truth. Don't forget to subscribe. Rome, 48 AD. While her husband, the Emperor Claudius, sleeps in the imperial palace, a woman slips out through a hidden passage. She wears a cheap blonde wig to conceal her dark hair, dressed in the garments of a common prostitute. No jewelry, no makeup that might identify her as nobility, just plain, worn fabric that smells of the streets. She moves swiftly through the shadowed alleys of Rome, her face concealed, heading toward the Suburra district, the foulest quarter of the city, where criminals lurk, where the poorest Romans dwell in decaying tenements, where violence and sickness linger, and where the cheapest brothels operate. She pushes open the door of one such brothel and steps inside. The madam knows her instantly despite the disguise. Everyone here understands who she truly is, yet they address her by her working name, Lysiska the She-Wolf. Because this woman slipping through Rome's most squalid district to work as a prostitute is Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, the most powerful woman in the world. And she is about to do something that will be remembered for 2,000 years. Before we reach that night, you must understand who Messalina was and how she became the most infamous woman in Roman history. She was born around 20 AD into one of Rome's most distinguished families. Her bloodline tied her directly to Augustus, the first Roman emperor. This was not simply aristocracy. This was royalty by Roman measure. She possessed everything: wealth, beauty, status, education. Ancient sources describe her with pale skin, golden hair, and refined features that made her stand out even among Rome's elite women. At roughly 17 years old, she was married to Claudius, a man more than 3 decades her senior. At that time, Claudius was not emperor. In fact, he was regarded as something of a joke by Rome's nobility. He limped, he stuttered, he sometimes drooled. Many considered him feeble-minded, but he had the correct lineage, and so did Messalina. Their union was a dynastic arrangement, merging 2 branches of the imperial family. Then, in 41 AD, everything shifted. Emperor Caligula, the deranged tyrant who had terrorized Rome for 4 years, was assassinated by his own guards. Caligula had descended into utter madness. He proclaimed himself a god, committed incest with his sisters publicly, appointed his horse as a consul, and ordered executions at random for amusement. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers charged with protecting the emperor, finally reached their limit and murdered him in a palace corridor. Now Rome had no emperor. The Praetorian Guard needed to install a successor immediately, before the Senate could reassert control, or before civil war erupted among rival military factions. They scoured the palace and discovered Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain, literally trembling with terror that he would be next. Instead, they hauled him out and declared him emperor. It was nearly a farce. Claudius had never been intended for power. His own family had mocked him his entire life for his physical ailments and social clumsiness. But the Praetorian Guard required someone from the imperial line, and Claudius was the last adult male descendant of Augustus still living. So they made him emperor. And suddenly, Messalina's bumbling, stammering, middle-aged husband was the most powerful man in the world. She was barely 21 years old, and she had just become Empress of Rome. Consider what this meant for her. She went from being the wife of a ridiculed, overlooked imperial relative to the first lady of the entire Roman Empire, literally overnight. She now possessed unimaginable wealth. She commanded thousands of slaves. She owned palaces, gardens, jewels, the finest garments and cuisine. She held the power to grant favors, to raise families to prominence, to ruin enemies. And most crucially, she had given birth to Britannicus, Claudius's son and heir. Her child would one day be emperor. She had everything a Roman woman could possibly desire. Most women would have been satisfied. You are married to the emperor. You have security, status, a guaranteed future for your children. What more could you want? But for Messalina, this was not enough. Not even close. The ancient Roman historians, writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, and Juvenal, all documented Messalina, and what they recorded was staggering. According to their accounts, Messalina possessed an insatiable sexual appetite that she indulged constantly and openly. She did not merely conduct affairs, which would have been scandal enough. She wielded her sexuality as an instrument of power and terror. She would identify men she desired, often married men, often men of political influence, and she would seduce them. Yet it was not seduction in any romantic sense. It was coercion. If a man refused her advances, terrible things befell him. He might be accused of crimes he did not commit. He could lose his position. He might wind up dead. So most men did not refuse. They could not. The Empress wanted them, and to say no could mean death. She targeted everyone, military commanders, senators, even actors and performers, which was especially scandalous, as Romans viewed actors as lower class, scarcely above slaves. One of her most infamous lovers was an actor named Nestor. She grew so obsessed with him that when he tried to refuse her, she went to Emperor Claudius himself and demanded that Claudius order Nestor to obey the Empress in all things. Claudius, apparently utterly oblivious to what was truly happening, agreed. So Nestor was legally compelled by the emperor to sleep with the Empress. It was madness. But Messalina's appetites extended far beyond affairs with powerful or attractive men. According to the Roman poet Juvenal, she led a secret life that scarcely anyone could believe. He wrote that Messalina would wait until Claudius fell asleep, then disguise herself and slip out of the palace. She would go to Subura, Rome's red light district, and work in a brothel under the name Lysiska, the she-wolf. Consider what this implies. The Empress of Rome, the most exalted woman in the civilized world, voluntarily laboring as a common prostitute in the foulest quarter of the city. Juvenal depicts her standing in the doorway of her brothel cubicle, her nipples painted gold, calling out to passers-by. She would work through the night, servicing customer after customer. And according to Juvenal, even when the brothel closed at dawn and she had to depart, she remained unsatisfied. She would stagger back to the palace, exhausted, yet still craving more. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds too extreme to be true, and you are right to be skeptical. Juvenal was writing satire, exaggerating to make a point. But here's the thing. Multiple ancient sources tell similar stories, and one particular story appears repeatedly in the historical record, recounted by different writers. The story of the competition. This account comes from Pliny the Elder, a respected Roman scholar and natural historian. He was not writing fiction or satire. He was recording what he believed to be fact. According to Pliny, Messalina decided to settle a question. Who had more sexual stamina, an empress or a professional prostitute? So she challenged Scylla, one of Rome's most famous prostitutes, to a contest. The rules were simple. Both women would take on as many male partners as they could over 24 hours. Whoever serviced more men would win. This was not done in secret. It was witnessed by members of the Roman nobility. Messalina organized it as a public spectacle for the entertainment of Rome's elite. The competition began. Scylla, being a professional who understood pacing and endurance, worked steadily through the night. By dawn, she had serviced 25 men, an impressive performance. She was exhausted, unable to continue. She had reached her absolute limit. Messalina kept going. She did not stop at 25. She continued past 30. Some sources suggest she went even higher. She only stopped when there were literally no more volunteers left, when every man present was too exhausted to continue. Messalina won. The Empress of Rome had defeated a professional prostitute in a marathon sex competition, and she did it before an audience of Roman nobles. Pliny the Elder records this as fact. He writes about it in his Natural History when discussing differences between human and animal sexual behavior. He states it matter-of-factly, as though it were an interesting data point about human capacity. Messalina, wife of Claudius Caesar, Thinking this a palm quite worthy of an empress, selected for the purpose of deciding to question one of the most notorious of the women who followed the profession of a hired prostitute, and the empress outdid her after continuous intercourse night and day at the 25th embrace. Now we must ask, why would she do this? Messalina had everything. She was beautiful, wealthy, powerful. She could have had any lover she wanted in private. Why turn her sexuality into a public spectacle? Why compete with a prostitute? Why risk the immense scandal that would follow if these stories became widely known? Modern historians debate this. Some argue she was genuinely a nymphomaniac, someone with a sexual compulsion she could not control. Others suggest it was about power. In Rome, women had very little official power. They could not vote, could not hold office, could not own property in their own names. But an empress could wield enormous unofficial influence through her husband, and Messalina may have realized she could gain even more power through sex. By seducing powerful men, she gained leverage over them. By forcing noble women to participate in her schemes, she gained blackmail material. By making her sexuality so extreme and so public, she created fear. No one knew what she might do next. No one felt safe refusing her. But there's another possibility historians have suggested. Maybe this was all propaganda. Perhaps Messalina's enemies, and she had many, spread these stories to destroy her reputation. After all, most of these accounts were written by men who lived after her death, men who had political reasons to paint her as a monster. Roman history is full of powerful women who were slandered by male historians. Cleopatra was called a seductress and a harlot, when in reality, she was a brilliant political strategist. Agrippina, who came after Messalina, was accused of sleeping with her own son, when there is no real evidence of this. So maybe Messalina was the victim of a historical smear campaign. Or maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Maybe she did have affairs. Maybe some stories are exaggerated. But perhaps there's a core of truth to these accounts. What we know for certain is how her story ended, and it ended badly. In 48 AD, Messalina made a fatal mistake. She fell in love. His name was Gaius Silius. He was young, handsome, intelligent, and ambitious. He was also a consul, one of the highest political positions in Rome. Messalina became obsessed with him, and Silius saw an opportunity. If he could marry the empress, if they could somehow get rid of Claudius, Silius could become emperor. They began plotting, but they grew impatient. While Claudius was out of Rome on official business, Messalina and Silius did something absolutely insane. They got married. They held an actual wedding ceremony, witnessed by Roman nobles, legally binding under Roman law. This was no longer a secret affair. This was public bigamy. This was treason. When Claudius found out, he was devastated. But his advisors and the Praetorian Guard were furious. This could not stand. Messalina had gone too far. Claudius ordered her arrest. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a beautiful estate on the edge of Rome that she had acquired through one of her political maneuvers. She knew what was coming. Roman law was clear on this. Treason meant death. Bigamy was grounds for execution, and she had committed both crimes publicly before witnesses. There was no way to talk her way out of this, no way to seduce or manipulate her way to safety. She had her mother with her, Domitia Lepida, the only person who still cared about her fate. Domitia begged her daughter to take her own life before the executioners arrived. It would be more dignified. It would spare her from public execution or torture. Romans believed that suicide in the face of inevitable death was an honorable choice, a way to retain some control over one's fate. But Messalina could not do it. She held a dagger in her hands, pressed the point against her throat multiple times, but she could not bring herself to push it in. She was too afraid. She wanted to live, even though she knew she had no future. So she waited. The soldiers arrived, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, sent by Claudius with explicit orders. They found her in the gardens with her mother. There was no trial, no opportunity to defend herself. No chance to speak to Claudius one last time. The tribune drew his sword. Domitia Lepida held her daughter as the blade came down. Messalina died there in the gardens, stabbed to death before her own mother, her blood soaking into the expensive marble pathways she had once walked as empress. She was probably around 28 years old. She had been empress for 7 years. In those 7 years, she had become the most notorious woman in Rome, her name whispered in scandalous gossip throughout the city. And her children? Britannicus, her son who was supposed to become emperor, was only 7 years old when his mother was executed. He never recovered from this. Claudius remarried quickly, this time to Agrippina, who brought her own son Nero into the family. Agrippina systematically sidelined Britannicus and promoted Nero as Claudius's heir. When Claudius died, Nero became emperor, and shortly afterward, Britannicus died suddenly at a dinner party. Most historians believe Nero had him poisoned. Messalina's daughter, Octavia, was forced to marry Nero. He treated her cruelly, eventually divorcing her on false charges of adultery and having her executed. Both of Messalina's children died young and violently, victims of the same political machinations their mother had once practiced. But she was not forgotten. Instead, she became legendary. For 2,000 years, writers and artists have been fascinated by Messalina. Poets wrote about her. Painters depicted her. Sculptors carved her image. Playwrights created dramas about her life. In the Renaissance, she became a symbol of female sexual excess. In the Victorian era, she was used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled female sexuality. In the 20th century, she appeared in films and novels, always portrayed as the ultimate femme fatale, the woman whose appetites could never be satisfied. The most famous artistic representations show her in that brothel, standing in the doorway waiting for customers, or lying exhausted after the competition with Scylla. These images became iconic in Western art. They shaped how people thought about female sexuality, about power, about Rome itself. But here's what is truly interesting. Modern historians are starting to question everything we thought we knew about Messalina. They are looking at the sources more critically and realizing that almost everything written about her was written by her enemies or by historians who never met her and were working from second-hand accounts. They are noticing that the accusations against Messalina follow patterns. The same accusations were made against many powerful Roman women: sleeping around, poisoning enemies, manipulating weak husbands. These were standard slanders used against women who threatened male power. They are also noticing that Messalina was actually politically active and effective. She influenced appointments. She managed patronage networks. She secured positions for her allies. She was doing what emperors' wives did, using the power available to her. But because she was a woman, these actions were reframed as sexual manipulation. The story of the 25 men might be complete fiction. Pliny the Elder was not even in Rome when Messalina was alive. He was a young man studying in northern Italy. He could not have witnessed the competition. He was reporting gossip, rumors, stories that were already circulating years after her death. Juvenal was writing satire decades later, deliberately exaggerating to criticize Roman morals. The story of her working in a brothel under a fake name that might have been invented by her enemies to humiliate her memory. After all, if you wanted to utterly destroy a Roman woman's reputation, accusing her of prostitution was the most devastating thing you could do. So perhaps Messalina was just a young woman who found herself empress before she was ready, who tried to exert power in the only ways available to her, and who made a fatal political miscalculation when she allied with Silius. Maybe the sex stories are exaggerations or complete fabrications meant to justify her execution and erase her from history. Or maybe some of it was true. Maybe she really did have numerous affairs. Maybe she really did use sex as a political weapon. Maybe she really was extraordinarily sexually active by any standard. The truth is, we will never know for certain. The real Messalina is lost to history. What we have are the stories, the legends, the accusations. And those stories have had enormous influence on Western culture for 2,000 years. They have shaped how we think about female sexuality and power. They have provided endless material for artists and writers. They have become part of the mythology of Rome. Whether the stories are true or not, Messalina became a symbol of unchecked female sexuality, a symbol of how power can corrupt, a symbol of the decadence of Rome. Her name became synonymous with promiscuity. For centuries, calling a woman a Messalina was one of the worst insults you could use. But there is something else worth considering. Even if some of these stories are true, even if Messalina really did sleep with dozens or hundreds of men, what does that actually tell us? It tells us about a world where women had almost no agency except through their sexuality. It tells us about a society so obsessed with controlling female sexuality that any woman who seemed to enjoy sex or use sex for her own purposes was immediately branded as deviant and monstrous. It tells us about how history is written by the powerful and how women's stories are twisted to serve political purposes. Messalina lived in a world where being empress gave her enormous privilege, but very little actual power. She could not make laws. She could not command armies. She could not even fully control her own property. What power did she have? The power to influence her husband, the power to build networks of loyalty, and possibly the power of her own sexuality. If she chose to use that power in extreme ways, if the stories about her are even partially true, can we really be that surprised? She was a young woman thrust into an impossible position, surrounded by men who were plotting and scheming for power, living in a world of constant political danger where the wrong alliance or the wrong enemy could mean death. She was trying to survive and thrive in a system that was rigged against her from the start. And when she finally overreached, when she made the mistake of thinking she could marry Silius and somehow get away with it, the system destroyed her, swiftly, brutally, and then tried to erase her from history entirely. The story of Messalina and the 25 men has survived for 2 millennia. It has been told and retold countless times. It has inspired art, literature, opera, film. It has become one of the most famous scandalous stories from ancient Rome. But maybe the real story is not about sex at all. Maybe it is about power. About how a young woman tried to carve out power in a world that denied her any legitimate path to it. About how the men around her, threatened by her influence, destroyed her, and then destroyed her memory by turning her into a monster of insatiable lust. Maybe the real scandal is not what Messalina did or did not do in that brothel. Maybe the real scandal is how history treated her, how her story was warped and weaponized, how she became a cautionary tale used to scare women into submission for centuries. We will never know the real Messalina. The historical record is too tainted, too politicized, too distant. But her legend survives, darkest chapters of history, without looking away. And that legend, whether rooted in truth and propaganda or in some tangled blend of both, tells us something essential about Rome, about power, about sexuality, and about how we remember the past. This is the story of Messalina, the Roman empress who was said to have slept with 25 men in a single night. Whether she truly did it or whether it was a vicious lie spun by her enemies, we may never know for sure. What we do know is this: her story has captivated people for 2,000 years. We know she lived in extraordinary times, wielded extraordinary influence, and met an extraordinary end. And we know her legend, true or not, has left an extraordinary imprint on how Western civilization thinks about women, sex, and power. If this story revealed a hidden side of Roman history to you, subscribe to Sinister Empires. We dig into the scandalous, the shocking, and the suppressed stories of the past. There are more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more legends waiting to be examined, more truths waiting to be told. This is Sinister Empires, where we face the darkest chapters of history without looking away.